I know what it feels like to win. I know the weight of a Michelin star in your hands. The way the room goes quiet when they call your name. The way champagne tastes different when you've earned it. I know what it feels like to stand at the top of something you spent your entire life building and feel nothing but the echo of one voice you left behind. That's the part they don't put in the press releases. That's the part I couldn't outrun no matter how many oceans I put between us. My name is Celeste Beaumont. I'm 34 years old. I'm the youngest female chef to receive a Michelin star in Paris in over a decade, and I am standing in the back hallway of a restaurant in Chicago with my heart on the floor, because I just heard the woman I walked away from say 3 words through a cracked door that rearranged every single thing I thought I knew about the last 8 months of my life. People always ask me when I knew I wanted to be a chef. The honest answer is that I knew the same week I knew I was in love with River Okafor. I was 22, broke, burning everything I touched in a shared kitchen in Wicker Park, and she walked in with flour on her cheek and the audacity to tell me my roux was wrong. She wasn't even a cook. She was a nursing student who'd wandered into the wrong apartment. But she was right about the roux, and I never quite recovered from that. We spent the next 10 years building a life the way you build a good dish. Slowly, deliberately, layering things on top of each other until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. She supported every late night, every failed pop-up, every burned batch of dreams. And when Paris called, I told myself she'd be fine. I told myself we'd be fine. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be nothing but smoke. 8 months. That's how long I was gone. 8 months of video calls that got shorter, texts that got slower, and a silence between us that I mistook for distance when it was actually grief. I didn't know it then. I do now. I found out the hard way. The way you find out all the things that matter. By accident, in a hallway, when the universe decided I'd been comfortable long enough. I came back to Chicago for a guest appearance at Maison Noire, a 3-night event, a favor for an old mentor. I wasn't supposed to stay. I wasn't supposed to feel anything. I was supposed to cook, smile, collect the check, and fly back to my life. Instead, I took a wrong turn looking for the dry storage room, and I heard her voice. Low and tired, and so painfully familiar that my whole body stopped before my brain could catch up. And then I heard what she said. And I understood, with a clarity that no amount of culinary training prepares you for, that I had made the biggest mistake of my life, and that it had a heartbeat. I pushed the door open slowly, the way you open something you're not sure you should. The kitchen was small. A prep kitchen, really, more storage than workspace. And the light inside was the kind of yellow that makes everything look like a memory. River was standing with her back to me, one hand pressed flat against the counter, the other holding her phone to her ear. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt I didn't recognize, and her hair was pulled up the way she always wore it when she was tired. And she was, there is no other word for it, enormous, round and full and unmistakably, undeniably pregnant. My brain did the math before I gave it permission. 8 months. She was at least 8 months along. And in the corner of the room, visible through the open door of what must have been a converted office, a woman sat in a wheelchair with a blanket across her lap, watching a television with the volume too low to matter. River's mother, Ms. Adaez, a woman who used to press my face between her palms and call me her daughter-in-love. She looked smaller than I remembered. She looked like someone the world had been leaning on too hard. River said softly, into the phone, "We're going to be okay. Just the 3 of us." And that was it. That was the sentence that broke me open. There is a version of this story where I made the right choice. I've told it to myself enough times that I almost believe it. In that version, I was practical. I was ambitious. I was a woman who understood that opportunities like the one Michel Baudreau was offering don't come twice. And I took it with both hands, and no apologies. In that version, I was brave. The truth is messier than that. the way truth always is when love is involved. The truth is that I was 28 years old and terrified. Not of leaving, but of staying and always wondering. Not of losing River, but of becoming someone she'd eventually resent for the dreams I'd buried to keep her comfortable. I told myself I was protecting us both. I told myself that 6 months in Paris would make me better. A better chef, a better partner, a better version of the woman she'd chosen. I told myself she agreed, and she did agree. That's the part that still keeps me up at night, even now, even after everything. She smiled and said, "Go." And I went. And neither of us said the thing that needed to be said. Michel Baudreau found me on a Tuesday in March, 3 years into my tenure as sous chef at Linden & Co., the kind of Chicago restaurant that gets written about in magazines, but never quite earns the stars it deserves. I was 33, restless in the specific way that talented people get restless when they can feel their ceiling. I'd been pushing Chef Harmon for more creative control for 2 years, and he kept promising and pivoting, until the promise started to feel like a door he had no intention of opening. Michel walked in for a private dinner on a Tuesday. Quiet night, small party, the kind of booking that doesn't raise flags, and somehow ended up in my kitchen at 11:30, after the last table had cleared, eating the staff meal I'd made from the day's leftover components. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just ate. And then he looked up and said, in his precise Parisian English, that I cooked like someone who had more to say than anyone was letting her say. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. I did neither. I just refilled his glass and asked him what he meant. What he meant was an apprenticeship at Maison Étoile in the 7th arrondissement. His restaurant, 2 Michelin stars, a waiting list that stretched 18 months. What he meant was 6 months, possibly a year, full creative collaboration on a new tasting menu he was developing for the following season. What he meant was the kind of opportunity that restructures the entire architecture of a career, the kind that chefs write about in memoirs and thank in acceptance speeches. I sat with it for 3 days before I told River. 3 days of carrying it around like something fragile, turning it over in my hands, looking at it from every angle. I knew what it meant. I knew it meant leaving. I knew it meant disruption and distance and the particular loneliness of a long-distance relationship between 2 people who had never once spent more than 2 weeks apart in a decade. But I also knew that if I didn't go, some part of me would slowly, quietly, begin to disappear, and that eventually River would notice the disappearing and wonder if she'd caused it. River was in the kitchen when I told her. Our kitchen, in the apartment on Paulina Street, the one with the window above the sink that looked out onto the alley in the neighbor's garden. She was making tea, chamomile, the kind she always made when she'd had a long shift. And she was still in her scrubs, her back to me, and I watched her shoulders for a moment before I spoke. I had rehearsed the conversation 100 times. I had prepared for every possible reaction: anger, tears, negotiation, ultimatum. What I had not prepared for was the stillness that came over her when I finished talking. She didn't turn around right away. She just stood there, both hands wrapped around the mug, steam rising between her fingers. And I could see the line of her jaw from where I stood, and I could see that she was working through something I didn't have access to. When she finally turned, her face was composed in the way that River's face gets composed when she has decided something privately that she isn't ready to share publicly. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she smiled, soft and real and devastating. And she said, "Go, Celeste. This is everything you've worked for." I should have pushed, I know that now. I should have sat down at that table and said, "What aren't you telling me?" Because in 10 years, I had learned to read the difference between River's real smile and River's brave one. And that night, she was giving me the brave one, and I chose not to see it. I chose to hear the words and ignore the frequency underneath them. I chose Paris, and for 8 months, I told myself that choosing Paris was not the same as choosing wrong. I threw myself into the work with the kind of focus that only grief produces, though I didn't know it was grief yet. I learned Michelle's techniques and unlearned my own bad habits, and developed a palette that the critics called extraordinary and the other apprentices called inhuman. I called River every few days, then every week, then when I could. The calls got shorter, the silences between texts got longer, and somewhere in that slow drift, I stopped noticing that she never once asked me to come back. I thought it was strength. It was something else entirely. The night before I flew back to Chicago for the Maison Noire event, I reread our last text exchange. It was brief, almost clinical the way our conversations had become. I'd told her I was coming back for a few days. She'd said, "Safe travels." 2 words. The woman who used to write me paragraphs at 2 a.m. about things she'd read and thought and dreamed had sent me 2 words. And I'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji and gone to sleep without thinking twice about it. That's the thing about losing someone slowly. You don't notice the bleeding until you're already empty. I boarded that plane with a carry-on full of confidence and a chest full of something I hadn't yet named. I know now what it was. It was the particular weight of a love you've been careless with, beginning to make itself known. It was the bill arriving, and I wasn't ready for what it was going to cost me. Chicago looked the same, and felt completely different, the way places always do when you're the one who's changed. I took a cab from O'Hare with the window down despite the October cold, watching the skyline come back into frame like a painting I used to live inside. I wasn't thinking about River, or I was trying not to, which is the same thing dressed differently. I was thinking about the menu for the first night, about the components I'd prepped in my head on the plane, about the kind of impression I wanted to make on the Chicago food scene after a year away. I was thinking like a chef. That's what I do when I'm afraid. I narrow my world down to what I can control: heat, timing, flavor, texture, and I stay inside that world until the fear passes, or I'm too tired to feel it. It's a good strategy for a kitchen. It's a terrible strategy for a life. Maison Noire was everything its reputation promised. Dark wood, low light, the kind of quiet elegance that makes people lower their voices instinctively. Chef Dominic Reyes, my old mentor, met me at the back entrance with a handshake that turned into a hug and a kitchen tour that turned into a 3-hour conversation about where fine dining was headed and where I fit inside that future. He had aged well, the way people age when they love their work, and being in his kitchen felt like muscle memory, familiar and grounding, and exactly what I needed after a transatlantic flight and a heart full of unprocessed things. We ate together at the Pass around midnight, the way kitchen people always eat, standing up, fast, something improvised from the day's components. And I felt, for the first time in months, like myself. Like the version of myself I'd gone to Paris to find. And then I went looking for the dry storage room. That was all it was. I needed to check the spice inventory before the morning delivery. A simple task, a 2-minute errand. The hallway behind the main kitchen split in 2 directions, and I took the wrong one. And that is the entire geography of how my life changed. I heard her before I saw her. That voice, low and a little hoarse, the way River's voice always got when she was running on too little sleep and too much responsibility, coming from behind a half-open door at the end of the hall. My feet stopped. My brain said, "Keep walking." My heart said absolutely not. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a full minute, just breathing, just listening to the cadence of her, without hearing the words. The way you press your thumb against a bruise to confirm it's still there. And then the words came through, quiet and exhausted, and full of a love so fierce it barely fit in the room. We're going to be okay. Just the 3 of us. 3 words that rewrote 8 months in an instant. 3 words that told me everything River had carried alone. The pregnancy, the fear, the decision not to tell me, the daily act of choosing silence to protect a dream that was mine, not hers. I pressed my back against the wall, and I closed my eyes, and I understood, with the full weight of a woman who has just seen the exact shape of her own failure, that I had left behind more than a relationship. I had left behind a family, and the only question that mattered now, the only question that had ever mattered, was whether it was too late to find my way back to it. There are things you don't know about the person you love until you lose them. Not the big things. The big things you learn early, in the first months, when everything is new and you're paying attention to every detail like it might disappear. The small things. The private architecture of who they are when no one is performing for anyone. I knew that River Okafor cried at documentaries about animals but never at movies about people. I knew she kept a list in her phone of words she found beautiful. Not meaningful, just beautiful, purely for the sound of them. I knew she slept on her left side and woke up reaching for something, even before I was there to be reached for. I knew that when she was afraid, she got very quiet and very organized, as if tidiness were a form of armor. I knew all of this. And somehow, in the 8 months I spent building a career in Paris, I forgot to apply any of it to the silence she gave me. I forgot that River going quiet was never indifference. It was always a form of protection. I just didn't know until that hallway who she was protecting. The story of River and the fertility clinic did not come to me all at once. It came in pieces, the way difficult truths always come. A fragment here, a detail there, assembled slowly into something I could barely stand to look at directly. The first piece came from Ms. Adaze, 3 days after I found River in that kitchen, in a conversation that River didn't know was happening. I had gone back the next morning. I'll get to that. I'll get to the look on River's face when she turned around and saw me standing in that doorway. But what I need to tell you first is the before. Because the before is the part that explains everything. The before is the part that broke me more completely than any single moment of the after. River had wanted a baby for a long time. Not urgently. Not in the way some people want things with a kind of frantic, grasping energy. But steadily. The way she wanted most things, with a quiet certainty that never needed to announce itself. She had mentioned it to me twice in our years together. Once lightly, in the abstract, on a Sunday morning when we were still in bed and the neighbor's kid was crying through the wall and she'd said, almost to herself, that she thought she'd be good at it. And once directly, 2 years before Paris, when we were sitting on the roof of our building in July, and she'd turned to me and said she was ready when I was. I'd said we had time. I'd said let's wait until things settle. Things, in my vocabulary, meant my career. Things meant the restaurant, the reviews, the next step, the next level. I was always waiting for things to settle. They never do. That's the thing about things. River had started the fertility process quietly, on her own, in the January before Michel Baudreau walked into my kitchen. I didn't know this. I didn't know she had done the research, chosen the clinic on West Diversey, met with the specialist twice, and begun the preliminary blood work that would determine whether her body was ready to do what her heart had already decided. She didn't tell me because she wasn't ready to tell me. Not yet. Not until she knew it was real. Not until she had something concrete to bring to the conversation, instead of just a want. River was not a woman who led with need. She led with fact. She needed the fact first. And the fact, by the time Michel made his offer in March, was that the first round of insemination had just been scheduled for the following week. She was holding two things at once, the possibility of a baby and the reality of my opportunity. And when I sat down across from her at that kitchen table and told her about Paris, something in her calculation shifted in a way I can only understand now, in retrospect, with the particular clarity of hindsight that feels less like wisdom and more like punishment. She decided not to tell me. That decision deserves to be held carefully, because it is not a simple one, and River was not a simple woman. She didn't hide the pregnancy out of malice or pride or the desire to wound me later. She hid it because she loved me in the specific, self-erasing way that certain people love. The kind that says your happiness is more important than my fear. Your dream is worth more than my need for you to stay. She looked at me across that kitchen table, with my eyes full of Paris and my future rearranging itself into something luminous. And she made a choice that cost her everything. She let me go. She smiled the brave smile. She said the words. And then, 1 week later, alone in a clinic on West Diversey with a nurse named Patricia who held her hand through the entire procedure, she began the process of becoming a mother. Without me. Because of me. Both things are true, and I have to live inside both of them. The pregnancy took on the first try. River told me this later, in a voice completely devoid of drama, the way she delivered all her most devastating information, plainly, directly, without decoration. Her body, it turned out, had been ready for a very long time. Patricia had told her it was rare, first attempt success, and River had sat in the parking lot of the clinic for 45 minutes afterward, crying in the specific silent way she reserved for joy too large to be expressed out loud. She had called her mother that afternoon. Ms. Adaise, who was already beginning the slow decline that the doctors had named but not yet measured, had wept openly on the phone and said, in Igbo first, then English, because that was always how she moved between her deepest feelings, that the baby was a gift arriving exactly on time. River had agreed. She had not called me. She had looked at my name in her phone for a long time, and then she had put the phone down and gone to make tea. And that was the beginning of the silence that I mistook for distance. I want to be precise about what that silence cost her, because I think it's important, and because I think it's easy, from the outside, from the comfortable distance of someone who didn't have to live it, to flatten River's choice into either heroism or cruelty, and it was neither. It was survival. She worked her nursing shifts through the first trimester without telling a single colleague, wearing scrubs that hid the changes in her body, eating crackers in the supply closet between rounds because the nausea came without warning, and she had learned to manage it privately. She came home to the apartment on Paulina Street, our apartment, which she was still paying for alone because I had offered to keep contributing from Paris, and she had told me not to, insisted it was fine, that she had it covered. And she would sit at the kitchen table with her hands on her still small belly and talk to the baby in a low voice about the day. I know this because Ms. Adaise told me. I know this because Ms. Adaise, in the late stages of the illness that had begun stealing her memory in increments, had held on to this particular image with a fidelity that made me understand what mothers keep when everything else starts to go. The apartment on Paulina Street lasted until June. River's lease was up, and the landlord had raised the rent by $400, and with Ms. Adaise's medical bills beginning their slow accumulation, and a baby coming in November, and a body that was starting to make the physical demands of pregnancy known in ways that affected her nursing shifts, the math simply stopped working. She found a smaller place in Pilsen, 2 bedrooms, ground floor, close to the bus line she needed for the hospital where her mother was being treated 3 times a week. She packed up the apartment we had shared without ceremony, without drama, because River was not a woman who performed her pain. She told me she was moving in a text that was 4 sentences long. I had responded with, "Makes sense. Let me know your new address." I did not ask why. I did not call. I had a service that week, a 12-course tasting menu I had spent 3 months developing, and I was deep inside the tunnel of it, the way I always got deep inside the work when the work was going well. I am not proud of this. I am telling it plainly because the truth of who I was in those months is part of the story, and I owe it to River to tell it without making myself more sympathetic than I deserve. By September, Ms. Adaise had moved in with River. The diagnosis had progressed from manageable to urgent, in the way these things do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a series of small declines that each felt survivable, until suddenly, the accumulated weight of them was not. River converted the 2nd bedroom into her mother's room, and slept on a pull-out sofa in the living room, her enormous belly making the logistics of everything more complicated and more tender at once. She learned to cook her mother's favorite dishes from memory and from phone calls with her aunts in Lagos, filling the small apartment with smells that Miss Daisy said took her home. She kept working until her 34th week, when her supervising doctor finally sat her down and said the word rest with enough authority that even River couldn't argue with it. She had saved enough to cover 6 weeks without income. She had a list, color-coded, of every expense through the baby's first 3 months. She had a plan. River always had a plan. What she didn't have was anyone to call at 2 in the morning when the fear got too big for the apartment. That last part is the one I come back to. Not the logistics, not the finances, not even the physical exhaustion of a woman doing everything alone in her 3rd trimester. All of that is staggering. All of that lands on me with a guilt I am still learning to carry. But it's the 2 in the morning part that undoes me. Because I know what River's 2 in the morning looks like. I know the specific quality of her fear in the dark. The way it's never abstract, never general, always precise and detailed. A list of specific things that could go wrong presented to her by her own mind with clinical thoroughness. I know that she would have lain on that pull-out sofa, with her hands on her belly, and her mother's soft breathing coming through the wall, and she would have been afraid in the particular way that brave people are afraid, completely, privately, without asking anyone for help. And I know that somewhere in those nights, my name came up, not as a comfort, as a question, as the shape of something that might have been different. I didn't know any of this when I heard her voice in that hallway. I knew it in my body before I knew it in my mind. The way you know sometimes that a thing is true before you have the language to explain it. I pressed my back against that wall, and I let the knowledge arrive in whatever order it wanted, and I did not move, and I did not speak. And the only thing I was aware of, beneath the guilt and the grief and the disorienting vertigo of a life rearranging itself, was the sound of River's voice saying, "We, not I, not me, but we," with a ferocity that was so quietly enormous, it filled the entire hallway and reached all the way to Paris, and undid every story I had told myself about why leaving had been the right thing to do. There is a moment, in cooking, when you have to commit. It happens at the stove, usually, a point of no return where the heat is high and the pan is ready, and if you hesitate, if you second-guess the timing by even a few seconds, you ruin everything you've been building. Michel used to call it le moment de vérité, the moment of truth. He said the difference between a good chef and a great one wasn't talent or technique or even creativity. It was the willingness to commit fully, at exactly the right moment, without flinching. I had spent my entire career learning to do that in the kitchen. I had spent considerably less time learning to do it anywhere else. Standing in that hallway, back against the wall, heart doing something I didn't have a culinary metaphor for, I understood that I had arrived at one of those moments. I could walk away. I could go find the dry storage room, check the spice inventory, go back to Chef Reyes's kitchen and pretend I had heard nothing. And in the morning I could fly back to Paris with my Michelin star and my clean conscience and my carefully constructed life. That was one door. The other door was the one at the end of the hallway, half open, with River's voice coming through it like something I had never stopped hearing, even when I was trying to. I pushed it open, not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about the physical act of it. I just put my hand against the wood and let the door swing inward and stood in the frame. And for a full 3 seconds neither of us moved or spoke or breathed in any way that was audible. River had turned at the sound. She was still holding her phone, still standing at the counter, one hand pressed flat against the surface in that way she had of grounding herself physically when she was caught off guard. And she looked at me. That was all. She just looked at me, and I looked at her. And the room between us was very small and very full of everything we hadn't said in 8 months. She was more beautiful than I had allowed myself to remember. That sounds like a small thing, but it isn't. It's actually an enormous thing. the specific cruelty of finding someone more beautiful than the version of them you've been carefully maintaining in your memory in order to make the distance bearable. Her face was fuller, the way pregnancy does to some women, softening angles into curves. Her eyes were the same, that particular dark brown that always looked lit from somewhere inside. And her belly. God. Her belly was the most real thing in the room. Round and present and impossible to look away from, changing the entire geometry of her body into something so fundamentally alive that I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. She said my name. Just that. Celeste. Not a question, not an accusation, just the two syllables of it, delivered in a voice so carefully neutral that I could hear, underneath the neutrality, every single thing she was working to contain. I have heard River say my name in 100 different registers over 10 years. Sleepy and warm in the morning, bright and teasing when she was in a good mood, low and serious when something was wrong. I had never heard her say it the way she said it in that moment, with that particular combination of resignation and vigilance. The voice of someone who has been anticipating a moment for so long that when it finally arrives, the only available response is a kind of exhausted calm. She had known on some level that this was coming. Maybe not this specifically, not the hallway, not the restaurant, not the exact Tuesday in October. But she had known that the world is small, and Chicago is smaller, and that Celeste Beaumont coming back was not a matter of if, but when, and she had been carrying the weight of that inevitability alongside everything else she was carrying. And now here I was, and she was saying my name, and neither of us knew what came next. I said, River. And then I said nothing else for what felt like a very long time, because there was too much, and the too much had no order and no hierarchy, and I couldn't find the first word of it. I looked at her belly, and then I looked at her face, and then I looked at her belly again, and I watched something move across her expression. Not guilt, exactly, and not defiance, but something in between. Something that looked like a woman bracing for impact while simultaneously refusing to apologize for her own survival. She straightened slightly, both hands coming to rest on the curve of her stomach in that unconscious protective gesture that I would come to know so well in the weeks ahead, and she lifted her chin just slightly, and she said, Before you say anything, I need you to know that I made this decision for myself, not to punish you, not to trap you, for myself. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. I could see them trembling, very slightly, against the fabric of her sweatshirt. I wanted to say the right thing. I had a long list of wrong things pressing against the back of my teeth. Questions and accusations and apologies and declarations. All of them fighting for space. All of them wrong in their own specific way. What came out was, How long have you known? And even as I said it, I understood it was the wrong question. Not cruel, just incomplete. Just the first available handhold on a wall too large to climb all at once. River held my gaze for a moment, assessing, measuring the question against whatever she'd prepared for. Then she said, Since February. February, 8 months ago, before Paris, before Michelle, before all of it. The word landed in my chest like something physical, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was there, and I felt the room tilt slightly. The way rooms tilt when the ground of what you thought you knew shifts underneath you without warning. She had known since February. She had let me go in March. She had carried this alone through an entire Chicago summer and into the fall, and she had not once, not in any of the calls that got shorter, the texts that got slower, the silence that grew between us like weather. She had not once given me the chance to choose differently. That was the thing I needed to sit with, not the pregnancy itself. Though that was enormous. That was its own entire world of feeling that I hadn't begun to properly enter yet. But the choice she had made on my behalf, without my knowledge, without my consent. The way she had looked at my future and decided, unilaterally, that I deserved to have it uncomplicated. The way she had loved me by removing herself from the equation, as if she were a variable that could simply be set aside, as if her presence in my life were optional rather than essential. I wanted to be angry about it. I tried, standing in that small kitchen with the yellow light and her mother's television murmuring in the next room. I tried to find the anger, because anger would have been cleaner, more manageable, easier to work with than what I actually felt, which was a grief so specific and so complete that it had no bottom. I was grieving 8 months I hadn't known to grieve. I was grieving every morning I had woken up in Paris feeling free when I should have been here. I was grieving the version of this that could have happened differently, the phone call that could have changed everything, the choice she had taken from me in the name of love. Ms. Adaizi's voice came from the other room, soft, a little confused, the voice of someone navigating a world that kept rearranging itself. "River? Who's there, my love?" And River turned toward the sound with a responsiveness so immediate and so complete that it told me everything about what her days looked like. The constant attentiveness, the way she had organized her entire existence around her mother's needs and her baby's needs, and left precisely nothing over for herself. "It's okay." "Mama," she called back, and her voice changed completely when she spoke to her mother. Softer, warmer, the careful steadiness of someone managing fear on behalf of someone they love. "Just someone from work." The words landed between us with a small, specific sting. Just someone from work. 10 years, a baby, a life dismantled and rebuilt, and in the language she used with her mother to avoid causing distress, I was just someone from work. I understood why. It didn't stop it from hurting. I asked if I could see her. "Miss Adaiz, I asked if I could go in and say hello, and I watched River's face do the complicated calculation of allowing that, weighing the warmth her mother would feel against the confusion it might cause, balancing the practical against the emotional with the particular efficiency of someone who had been making impossible calculations for months. She nodded, finally, slowly, and I followed her through the doorway into the small room where Ms. Adaiz sat in her wheelchair with a blanket across her lap, and the television showing a nature documentary with the sound too low to follow. She looked up when we came in, and her face did the thing that faces do when they recognize something beloved that they weren't expecting to see. She reached for my hand before I was fully in the room. "Celeste," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded nothing like it had in River's. It sounded like a homecoming, like something retrieved, like a word she had been keeping safe until it was needed. "You came back." I held her hand, and I did not cry, because crying felt like a luxury I hadn't earned yet. River stood in the doorway and watched us, and I did not look at her directly because I couldn't. Not yet. Not with her mother's hand in mine and the baby moving. I could see it. The subtle shift of River's belly. The life inside her making itself known at the exact wrong and right moment. And the weight of everything I had missed pressing down on me with a completeness that no kitchen, no award, no star had ever prepared me for. Ms. Adaiz told me I looked thin. She told me Paris must be cold. She told me, in a voice that had gone a little vague at the edges, the way her voice went sometimes according to River, that she had dreamed about me recently, that I had been in her kitchen making something that smelled like her mother's kitchen in Enugu, and that she had woken up hungry. I told her I would cook for her. The words came out before I had decided to say them. River made a small sound behind me. Not quite a protest, not quite agreement, something in between that contained multitudes. I turned to look at her then, finally, fully, and she was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed loosely beneath her belly, and her expression was the most River expression I had ever seen, guarded and tired and underneath both of those things, so far underneath that she probably thought I couldn't see it, something that looked very much like relief. I stayed for 2 hours that night. We didn't talk about the important things, not that night, not with Ms. Adaiz drifting in and out of the conversation, and the hour getting late, and River's exhaustion visible in every line of her body. We talked around the edges of everything, the way people do when they're not ready for the center. I told her Paris was cold and the work was good. She told me the Pilsen apartment had good light in the mornings. I asked how she was feeling and she said fine, the way she always said fine, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and we both understood that fine was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. When I finally stood to leave, I stood in the doorway of the small apartment and looked back at her, standing in the kitchen, one hand on the counter, the other on her belly, the yellow light making everything look like a memory again. And I said, "I'm coming back tomorrow." It wasn't a question. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her deciding, could see the exact moment when she stopped fighting the thing she actually wanted. And she said, "I know." 2 words. But these 2 words were nothing like safe travels. These 2 words were a door opening, and this time, I was not going to walk past it. She didn't ask me to leave politely. That's the thing about River, that I had somehow managed to romanticize in my memory during 8 months of distance. I had remembered her patience, her steadiness, her particular brand of quiet grace. And I had forgotten that underneath all of that lived a woman with a spine made of something harder than anything I had ever pulled out of a professional kitchen. When I knocked on her door the next morning with coffee and the full intention of staying, she opened it, looked at the cups, looked at me, and said, "Celeste, you need to go back to Paris." Not good morning, not come in, just that. Clean and direct and delivered with the kind of finality that tells you the person saying it has been awake since 4, rehearsing it. I stood in her doorway with 2 cups of coffee going cold in my hands, and I felt something harden in my own chest, something that had been soft and apologetic since the hallway 2 nights ago, beginning to calcify into something less willing to be managed. I said no. She blinked. In 10 years, that might have been the first time I had said no to River Okafor with that particular tone. Flat and certain, and completely unmovable. She stepped back from the door. I walked in. The apartment felt different in the morning light, smaller and more real than it had the night before when everything had been shock and softness and the careful navigation of a first conversation. Now it felt like a place where an argument was about to happen, and we both knew it, and neither of us was pretending otherwise. River had been up for a while. The kitchen showed signs of a breakfast already made and eaten, Miss Daisy's medications lined up on the counter in their daily organizer, the dishes drying in the rack with the particular neatness of someone who controls what they can control when everything else feels uncontrollable. She was dressed, hair pulled back, wearing the expression she wore when she had decided something and was prepared to defend it to the last. I set the coffees on the table. She didn't touch hers. I touched mine for something to do with my hands. The silence lasted approximately 15 seconds before it became unbearable, and we both started talking at the same time, her saying my name as a warning, me saying her name as a question. And then we both stopped, and she pressed her lips together, and I waited, because that much at least I had learned. When River was ready to speak, you waited. She said, "You have a life there, a real one, a Michelin star, a mentor who believes in you, a career that is finally becoming what you always said you wanted it to be. I am not going to be the reason you walk away from that." She said it the way she said all her most important things, plainly, without decoration, looking directly at me so I couldn't mistake the meaning or soften it with my own interpretation. I said, "You're not asking me to walk away from anything. I'm choosing to be here." She said, "You're choosing to be here because you feel guilty." The word guilty landed between us like something thrown. I felt the accuracy of it and the injustice of it simultaneously. The way you feel a diagnosis that is partly right and partly wrong and completely infuriating. I said, "That's not all it is." She said, "It's enough of it to be a problem." She was not wrong. She was also not entirely right. and the space between those two things was where the argument lived. I told her that guilt was not the same as love, but that they could exist in the same place at the same time, and that the presence of one didn't cancel the other. She told me that a woman 8 months pregnant with a sick mother and a studio pullout for a bed was not in a position to manage someone else's emotional reckoning. I told her I wasn't asking her to manage anything. I was asking her to let me be present. She told me that presence without a plan was just another form of abandonment waiting to happen. That one stopped me. I stood with it for a moment, turning it over, looking for the flaw in it, and I couldn't find one clean enough to argue with. She had watched me leave once already. She had watched me choose the next thing, the better opportunity, the brighter horizon, and she had smiled and said, "Go and spend 8 months paying the price of that smile alone." Why would she believe that this time was different? What had I done, in the 48 hours since the hallway, to demonstrate anything more than the guilt she had already correctly identified? I sat down at the table, not defeated. I want to be precise about that, but shifting strategies, the way you shift approaches in the kitchen when the first method isn't working and the dish still needs to get done. River remained standing, which told me everything about where she was. She was in defensive mode, and defensive mode for River meant staying on her feet, staying mobile, not allowing herself to settle into anything that felt like comfort, while the threat was still present. I was the threat. That knowledge sat in my chest with a particular kind of weight. I said, "Sit down, River." She said, "Don't tell me what to do in my own kitchen." I said, "Please." The please did something. Not much, but something. A slight softening around her eyes. A barely perceptible release of tension in her shoulders. She sat. Not across from me, but at the corner of the table, angled slightly away, which was River's version of a compromise. I asked her what she was actually afraid of. Not what she was angry about. Not what she objected to logistically. What she was afraid of, underneath all the practical architecture of her resistance. She looked at the table for a long moment. I could see her deciding how honest to be. Could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. And I waited without filling the silence, which was the hardest thing I had done in recent memory, and possibly ever. Finally, she said, without looking up, "I'm afraid you'll stay until the baby comes and then realize this isn't the life you chose and leave again. And this time the leaving will happen in front of a child who will understand it." The room went very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. Inside, Ms. Adesi's television murmured from the other room, too low to make out words. I looked at River's profile, the line of her jaw, the way she was holding herself together with visible effort, and I understood that this was not an argument about Paris, or about guilt, or even about the last 8 months. This was about a woman who had been left once by someone she trusted completely, and who had reorganized her entire life around the certainty that she would not survive being left again. Not in front of a child. Not like that. I said, "That's a fair thing to be afraid of." She looked up. I think she had expected me to argue, to reassure, to pour words into the fear until it looked smaller. Instead, I sat with the fairness of it, and something in my acknowledgement of it shifted the temperature of the room by a degree or two. Not fixed, not resolved, but different. I said, "I can't promise you that fear away. I know that. I know that anything I say right now is just words, and you have no reason to trust my words over my actions. And my actions for the last 8 months have not been the actions of someone who understood what they had." River's jaw tightened. She was listening. I said, "But I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you to let me be here today, and tomorrow, and the day after. And I'm asking you to let my presence be the argument, not my words." She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I became aware of the baby moving, that subtle shift beneath her sweatshirt that I had noticed the night before. life asserting itself with complete indifference to the emotional complexity of the room. I watched it happen, and something in my face must have changed, because River looked down at her own belly and then back at me, and the defensiveness in her expression cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. She said, "You have a service tonight." I said, "I know," she said, "and 2 more after that." I said, "Yes," she said, "and then you have a flight." I said, "I have a flight. I haven't decided whether to take." She opened her mouth and I said, "River, I know, I hear you. I'm not making promises I can't back up. I'm telling you that the flight is a question, not an answer, and I need a few more days before I can answer it honestly." She looked at me with an expression that was exhausted and guarded, and underneath both of those things, very, very tired of being brave. She said, "A few more days." Not a yes, not a no. A few more days, delivered with the caution of someone extending a very small amount of credit to a very uncertain investment. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Just don't make me regret it." I stayed for 2 hours that morning. We didn't touch. Not once. Not even accidentally. Maintaining the careful physical distance of people who know that touch would complicate the negotiation they're still in the middle of. But we talked, and the talking was different from the night before. Less careful, more honest, with actual friction in it. The kind of friction that means 2 people are taking each other seriously enough to push back. She told me that the doctor had said the baby could come any time in the next 2 to 4 weeks. I did the math without meaning to. 2 to 4 weeks put me past my flight, past my return to Maison Étoile, past the menu planning session Michel had scheduled for November. I did not say this out loud. She saw me doing it anyway, because River had always been able to read my face like a prep list. Quickly, accurately, without missing anything. She said, "You're doing the math." I said, "I'm always doing the math." She said quietly, "Me too. I've been doing it for 8 months." When I left, she walked me to the door, which she hadn't done the night before. It was a small thing, and probably meant nothing, and I catalogued it anyway, the way I catalog everything that might be evidence of something I need to understand. I stepped into the hallway and turned back, and she was standing in the door frame, one hand on the door, looking at me with an expression that was so complicated and so familiar that it made my chest ache with the specific pain of things almost lost. I said, "I'll see you tomorrow." She said, "You have a service." I said, "After." She looked at me for one more moment, measuring, deciding, arriving at some private conclusion that she kept to herself. And then she nodded once and closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, the same hallway where this had all started, and I thought about how 2 nights ago I had pressed my back against this wall and heard 3 words that rearranged my life. And now I was standing in the same spot, and nothing was resolved, and everything was different, and the only thing I knew for certain was that I was coming back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until the math worked out or it didn't, but at least this time I was going to be present for the calculation. There is a particular kind of love that only exists between a woman and her mother's mother, or, in this case, between a woman and the mother of the woman she loves. It doesn't have a clean name in English. Other languages do better with it. The Igbo word obum-kem, which Ms. Adais had taught me years ago, sitting at her kitchen table in Bronzeville with a pot of egusi soup on the stove, means simply she is mine, not possessively, but protectively, the way you claim something precious that has been entrusted to your care. Ms. Adais had said it about me once, early in Rivers and my relationship, when she didn't know I could hear her. She had been on the phone with her sister in Lagos, describing me in the particular vivid way she described everything, with color and texture and the full weight of her attention. And she had said Obanki M and laughed and said in English, to herself or to her sister or to no one in particular, This one stays. I had held on to that for years. I held on to it differently now. Standing in her doorway on a Thursday morning with a bag of groceries, and the full understanding that staying was something I had failed at once already, and was trying, imperfectly and without guarantees, to learn how to do correctly. River had let me come back. That was not nothing. In the economy of trust we were operating in, careful, depleted, rebuilt from almost zero, letting me come back every morning was the equivalent of an enormous gesture, and we both knew it. And neither of us said so because saying so would have made it too fragile to hold. I had developed a routine in the 5 days since the hallway, the kind of routine that forms naturally when you are paying close attention to what is needed and quietly inserting yourself into the gaps. I arrived each morning after River's night. She slept badly, the pull-out sofa making everything worse, the baby pressing against her ribs in ways that no position fully resolved. And I brought coffee and whatever I had sourced from the market on the way, and I took the first hour with Ms. Adizi so that River could sleep the sleep of someone who had finally, temporarily, given the weight to someone else. It was the least I could do. It was also, in the specific mathematics of that apartment, everything. An hour of uninterrupted sleep for a woman in her 36th week of pregnancy who had been running on insufficient rest for months is not a small thing. It is the difference between functional and broken. River never said thank you. She didn't need to. I could see it in the way she moved when she emerged from the bedroom at 9. Less braced, less armored, fractionally more like herself. Ms. Adaze was the one who talked to me. River was still careful, still measuring every word, still maintaining the considered distance of someone who has been hurt and is not yet certain the hurt is over. But Ms. Adaze, whose illness had taken some things and left others entirely intact, had no patience for careful. She talked to me the way she had always talked to me, with the full force of a woman who considered directness a form of respect and silence, a form of waste. On the third morning, while River slept, and the October light came through the bedroom window, at the particular angle that made it look like late afternoon, even at 8 in the morning, Ms. Adaz held my hand across the small table and told me things about River that River would never have told me herself. Not secrets exactly. More like context. The kind of context that a mother holds for her child, the accumulated evidence of a whole person that the person themselves can't fully see because they're too busy living it. She told me that River had not cried when I left for Paris. Not once. Not in front of her. Not that she had seen or heard through walls. Not in any of the visits and phone calls of the weeks that followed. River had packed up the evidence of our life together with the same methodical efficiency she applied to everything, boxing my things and labeling them and putting them in storage without ceremony, and she had made her mother tea and sat at the kitchen table and talked about practical things. The new apartment, the baby's due date, the logistics of the months ahead. Ms. Adais said she had watched her daughter do this, and she had understood that River was not fine, that the not crying was not the same as not grieving, that her daughter had learned very young to grieve privately and completely, to take the full weight of a loss into a room by herself and come out the other side without requiring anyone to witness the process. She said, "I used to think it was strength. Now I think it was lonely." She said this without accusation, looking at the table, and I understood that she was not blaming me specifically. She was naming a pattern that had existed long before I arrived and would require more than my return to fully address. I asked her about the baby, not the logistics, the feeling. What it felt like to know that a grandchild was coming in this context, in this apartment, in these circumstances. Ms. Adaizi's face did the thing it did when something moved through her that was too large for a single expression, cycling through several things at once, landing eventually on something that was joy and grief and fierce determination all braided together. She said the baby was the best thing that had happened to this family in a long time, and that she intended to meet her. She said her with a certainty that I didn't question, and that she had been talking to her every night through River's belly when River was asleep on the sofa, telling her about Nigeria, and about Chicago, and about the grandmother who was going to love her with everything she had for as long as she had it. She said this last part steadily, without drama, with the particular courage of a woman who has been given a timeline and has decided to fill every moment of it completely. I held her hand, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and Ms. Adiz had never had patience for inadequate words. On the fourth morning, she asked me directly about Paris, not about the restaurant or the star or the career mechanics, about whether I was happy there. It was such a simple question and so rarely asked, in those exact words, by anyone in my life that I didn't have an immediate answer. I sat with it honestly, turning it over, resisting the impulse to give the polished version. Yes, it's extraordinary. The work is incredible. It's everything I worked toward, and trying to locate the true version underneath. I said, I was proud there, and I was good there, and I was lonely there in a way I kept mistaking for independence. Ms. Adesi nodded as if I had confirmed something she already knew. She said, River was lonely here in a way she kept mistaking for strength. The parallel landed with a precision that felt almost architectural. Two women on opposite sides of an ocean, performing the same emotional misdirection, missing each other in the same key. She squeezed my hand and said, You are both very stubborn and very foolish, and I don't have the time to wait for you to figure this out slowly. That last sentence changed the temperature of everything. Not because of the words themselves, though the words were pointed enough, but because of what lived underneath them. The timeline she had referenced was not abstract. The doctors had been clear with River, who had been carefully not clear with me, maintaining a version of the medical situation that acknowledged seriousness without quantifying it. Ms. Adiz had no such filter. She told me that fourth morning, in the same plain voice she used for everything, that the doctors had said months rather than years, and that months was a word that had a specific shape in this apartment. It meant the baby would know her grandmother, but perhaps not for long, and that knowledge was a presence in every room, in every meal, in every morning that I arrived with coffee and took the first hour so River could sleep. I sat with this information the way you sit with something that recontextualizes everything, quietly, with the full weight of it, without trying to make it smaller. River came out at 9 that morning to find her mother and me at the kitchen table with the remnants of breakfast between us, and what must have been a visible heaviness in the room, because she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at us both and said, What did you tell her? To me, not to her mother. Ms. Adesi said serenely, Everything. River looked at me and I looked at her, and something passed between us that was too complicated for the morning. An acknowledgement of a truth that had been managed, and was no longer being managed. A thing coming out of the room it had been kept in. River sat down at the table. Not at the corner, the way she had been sitting, angled away, maintaining the careful distance. She sat across from me, directly, the way we had always sat. She wrapped her hands around her mug. She said, She's getting worse faster than we thought. Not a question, a statement, an opening. I said, I know. She said, I don't know how to do all of this at the same time. It was the first time, in all the mornings I had been there, that she had said anything that admitted she couldn't do something. It cost her visibly. I could see what it cost her, in the slight tremor of her jaw, in the way her eyes went bright, and then were forcibly steadied. I said, You don't have to. She looked at me across the table with an expression that was so complicated and so open, more open than anything she had shown me since the hallway. And I understood that we had arrived somewhere new, past the argument, past the negotiation, past the careful management of distance. We were at the place where the real thing lived, the thing underneath all the protection, the thing that had existed between us for 10 years and had not, despite everything, stopped existing. Ms. Adiz watched us with the satisfied expression of a woman who has engineered an outcome she intended. River noticed and said, Mama, stop. Ms. Adiz said, "I'm not doing anything." She was absolutely doing something. I loved her for it completely. That afternoon, after River had gone to her prenatal appointment, the first one I had driven her to, a negotiation that had taken 20 minutes and ended with River in the passenger seat saying this doesn't mean anything in a tone that meant the opposite. Ms. Adiz called me back to her room. She was tired, the afternoon fatigue that came reliably now, and she was propped against her pillows with her hands folded and her eyes half closed. And she said, without preamble, "She never stopped loving you." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you love her?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then what are you still figuring out?" I didn't have an answer that was good enough for a woman measuring her time in months. She seemed to understand this, because she let me off the hook with a small sound that managed to be both forgiving and impatient. And she closed her eyes, and I sat with her until she slept. River found me there when she got back from the appointment, sitting beside her mother's bed in the small chair by the window, watching Ms. Adiz sleep with the afternoon light coming in at the angle that made everything look like a memory. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, and her face did the thing I had been watching it do all week. The cracking at the edges, the thing that kept almost becoming visible before she pulled it back. This time she didn't pull it back quite fast enough. This time I saw it clearly, fully, without ambiguity. It was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was love, old and tired and still completely intact, looking at me across a small room in a Pilsen apartment in October, as present and as undeniable as it had ever been. She didn't say anything. She just came and sat on the edge of her mother's bed, and we kept the vigil together in silence. And the silence, for the first time, felt like enough. There are conversations you can feel coming for days before they arrive. They exist in the atmosphere of a relationship like weather, a pressure change, a shift in the quality of the air, something that makes the skin on your arms register a difference before the mind has language for it. I had felt this one building since the morning River had said, "I don't know how to do all of this at the same time," and let me drive her to the prenatal appointment, and sat in the passenger seat of my rental car, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window, and said nothing for 11 blocks in a way that was not hostile, but deeply interior. The way River went interior when she was preparing for something. I had not pushed. I had learned. In the week since the hallway, that pushing River was like pushing a river. Not the woman, the actual thing, the body of water. In that the pushing accomplished nothing and exhausted the pusher, and the river continued at exactly its own pace regardless. So I had waited. I had shown up every morning. I had taken the first hour with Ms. Adiz. I had cooked and driven and sat in waiting rooms reading parenting magazines with the particular focus of someone doing research they hadn't planned to need. And I had waited. The conversation arrived on a Sunday, after Ms. Adiz's afternoon rest, when the apartment was quiet, and the light was doing its late October thing through the windows, and River came and found me in the kitchen, where I was prepping the ingredients for that evening's dinner. And she said, "I want to tell you about the clinic." I put down the knife. This is important. I put it down completely, stepped back from the counter, gave her my full and undivided attention without the mediation of any task, because River telling me something she had held for 8 months deserved the full surface area of my presence, and not the divided attention of someone who is also julienne in carrots. She noticed. She always noticed the quality of attention I brought to things. It was one of the things she had said she loved about me, early on, that I cooked and listened with the same completeness, that I didn't do either thing halfway. I had not brought that quality of attention to our relationship in the last year of it, and we both knew it. And putting down the knife was a small and inadequate gesture toward the person I was trying to become. But it was real. She sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from her. The apartment was quiet around us. Ms. Adiz sleeping. The street outside at its Sunday afternoon low volume. The refrigerator doing its small mechanical hum that I had already learned to hear as a kind of ambient heartbeat of the place. River put both hands flat on the table, a gesture I recognized as her version of grounding herself, and she began. She had started thinking about it seriously in the autumn before Paris, the autumn of the year before I left. When she was 32, and her mother's diagnosis had just arrived, and something in the arrival of that news had clarified things for her in the way that proximity to loss often does. She had not been panicking. She was clear about that. She was not making a fear-based decision, not rushing toward something because something else was ending. It was more that the diagnosis had burned away a certain amount of ambient noise and left her with a very clear picture of what she actually wanted, stripped of all the deferral and the waiting and the when things settled that had become the operating language of our shared life. What she wanted was a child. What she had wanted, for longer than she had been saying clearly, was a child with me. She had tried to say this twice, the Sunday morning through the wall, the July rooftop, and both times I had responded with time and waiting and the implication that her wanting was less urgent than my becoming. She had heard this. She had filed it. She had not stopped wanting. The decision to go to the clinic without telling me first was not impulsive. River did not do impulsive. It was the product of weeks of private reasoning that she walked me through now with the same methodical honesty she had brought to everything since the hallway, laying it out piece by piece, not to justify herself, but to make sure I understood the full architecture of it, because River believed that partial understanding was a form of unfairness, and she had not brought me this far to be unfair now. Her reasoning had been this. She wanted to know if her body was capable before she brought it to me as a conversation. She had watched too many couples have the fertility conversation in the abstract, and then spend years in the painful machinery of possibility before learning what was actually available to them. And she had not wanted to do that to us. She had wanted to come to me with a fact, not a hope. The fact, as it turned out, had arrived at the worst possible moment, the week of Michelle's offer, the week when my eyes were already full of Paris. And she had looked at the fact, and looked at my face, and made the choice she had made. I asked her about the donor. She had anticipated this question. I could see that she had anticipated it, had prepared for it, had decided how much to say, and in what order. She said the clinic had given her a profile, anonymous, as all their donors were, but detailed enough to feel like a person, rather than a data set. She had chosen carefully, over several weeks, with the same research thoroughness she brought to everything important. She had chosen someone healthy, someone with a family history that looked like longevity, someone who had written in his personal statement that he was donating because he believed in chosen families and wanted to contribute to ones that wanted to exist. She said this last part with a small, almost involuntary softness that told me it had mattered to her. That particular phrase, chosen families, in the mouth of a stranger who would never know how precisely it landed. I thought about that man, whoever he was, and I felt toward him something complicated and not entirely rational. Gratitude and irrelevance in equal measure, the acknowledgement that he had participated in something enormous and had no idea it existed. I asked the question I had been not asking for a week. I asked it carefully, from the side rather than head-on, the way you approach something you're not sure will hold your weight. Did you think about asking me? River was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at me with the directness that was her most fundamental quality, the willingness to look at a hard thing without flinching, and she said, "Yes, every day for 3 months." I said, "What stopped you?" She said, "You were already leaving, not in the way that people leave when they're done, in the way that people leave when they're becoming something. And I knew that if I asked you, you would have stayed, not because you wanted to, because you thought you should. And I couldn't do that to you, and I couldn't do that to a baby." The precision of it was devastating. She had seen me clearly enough to know that I would have stayed for the wrong reasons, and she had loved me enough to not let me. I sat with that for a long time, in the quiet kitchen, with the refrigerator humming and the afternoon going gold through the windows. I said, "You were protecting me from myself." She said, "I was protecting all of us." I said, "That wasn't your decision to make alone." She said, "I know." No defense, no elaboration, just the acknowledgement, plain and complete, the way River acknowledged the things she had decided and stood behind even while recognizing they had cost something. I appreciated this more than I could say. The absence of justification, the willingness to hold both things at once, to say I know without saying but. We sat with it together, the rightness and the wrongness of what she had done. And I thought about all the ways that love is also a form of presumption. The way it makes decisions on behalf of people, assigns them roles in its own story, determines what they can handle and what they can't, and acts accordingly, with the best intentions and the most imperfect results. River had loved me imperfectly. I had loved her imperfectly. We had both caused harm while trying to prevent it. That seemed, sitting in that kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October, like the most honest thing I could say about what had happened to us. She told me about the procedure itself. Patricia, the nurse, holding her hand. The particular quality of the light in the clinic that morning. She remembered it precisely. The way you remember sensory details from moments of enormous importance. The fluorescent brightness of it. The smell of the room. The sound of the equipment. And her own breathing. She said she had been afraid and certain at the same time, which she said was the strangest feeling she had ever had. Certainty and fear occupying exactly the same space without canceling each other out. She said that when it was over, and Patricia had told her to rest for a few minutes before getting up, she had lain there looking at the ceiling, and she had thought about me. Not with regret. She was clear about that. She had thought about me with love. The specific love of someone who is doing something courageous in honor of a life they intend to build. And she had said, to the ceiling, or to the universe, or to whatever version of me was present in that room, "I hope you're okay." I had been in Chicago. I had been in my kitchen at Linden & Co. on a Wednesday running a lunch service, completely unaware that my life was changing in a clinic on West Diversey, with or without my knowledge or consent. The positive test had come 11 days later. She told me about the parking lot, the 45 minutes of silent joy, the call to her mother. She told me about the moment she had almost called me. She had my name on her screen, her thumb over the call button, the phone in her hand in the parking lot of the clinic with the Chicago traffic going by indifferently and the late February sky doing its gray-white thing above the buildings. She had stayed like that for almost 5 minutes. And then she had put the phone in her pocket and started the car and gone to tell her mother in person. Because telling her mother in person was something she could do, something that was fully within her control, something that would be purely and uncomplicated joyful without the uncertainty and the complication that calling me would have introduced. I understood this. I hated it, and I understood it completely. She said, "I almost called you 100 times after that. Every week, every time something happened. The first ultrasound, the first time she moved, the day I found out she was a girl." She stopped. She had said she without meaning to. I could see the moment she registered it. A small flicker of something across her expression. I said very quietly, "A girl." River looked at me. Her eyes were bright again, the controlled brightness of contained feeling, and she said, "A girl." Something happened to me at that word. Not dramatically. Nothing in that kitchen was dramatic. Everything was quiet and real and lit by late afternoon light. But something shifted in my chest in a way that was permanent. The way certain things shift permanently, and you know in the moment that you will never be exactly the person you were before it. A girl. A daughter. A person who was already a person. Already a girl. Already existing in the world 8 months into being, pressing against her mother's ribs, and making herself known in the middle of hard conversations as if to say, "I'm here. I'm real. I'm the point of all of this." I had been thinking about the baby in the abstract, as a fact, as a consequence, as a dimension of the situation I was navigating. In the moment River said a girl, the abstract became completely, irreversibly concrete. I put my hand on the table, palm up, not reaching for River's hand, not claiming anything, just offering. She looked at my hand for a long moment. Then she placed hers in it. We sat like that in the quiet kitchen, not talking, the afternoon going darker around us. Her hand in mine for the first time since the hallway, since Paris, since before all of it. And the baby moved, visibly, and River looked down and then looked at me and almost smiled, and the almost was enough. And I held her hand and I did not let go. There is a moment in the process of rebuilding something broken when the work stops feeling like work and starts feeling like something else. Not easy, not resolved, but alive in a way that broken things aren't. A sourdough starter coming back after neglect. A sauce finding its consistency after 20 minutes of patient reduction. Something that was dormant, beginning, incrementally, to behave like itself again. I recognized the feeling because I had spent my entire career learning to read it in food, and I was beginning, cautiously, to read it in River. It didn't announce itself. It arrived in small things, the way all the important things arrive. A shift in the quality of the silence between us. A loosening at the edges of her posture when I came through the door in the mornings. The fact that she had stopped saying this doesn't mean anything every time I did something that clearly meant something. She had not invited me closer. She had simply stopped actively maintaining the distance, and in the economy of trust we were operating in, that was the equivalent of an enormous gesture. I received it carefully, the way you receive something fragile, with both hands, without squeezing, without making a sound that might startle it back into hiding. The first crack came on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I had a call with Michelle that morning. My first since arriving in Chicago. A conversation I had been postponing with the particular avoidance of someone who knows the call will require honesty they haven't yet organized. And I had taken it outside on the front steps of the Pilsen apartment while River was doing her morning routine with her mother, sitting in the cold October air with my phone pressed to my ear and Michelle's voice coming through it with the precise, warm authority that had always made me want to be better in the kitchen. He asked how the Maison Noire nights had gone. I told him they had gone well. He asked when I was coming back. I said I needed a few more days. There was a pause. Michelle's pauses were never empty. They were always doing something, processing or measuring or deciding. And then he said, in the careful way he said things when he was being generous with someone he respected, "Celeste, whatever is keeping you in Chicago, I hope it is worth the keeping." I said, "I think it might be." He said, "Then take your time, but not too much time. The kitchen misses you." He meant it kindly. It landed with the particular weight of a life waiting on the other side of a decision I hadn't made yet. River was in the kitchen when I came back inside, standing at the stove with her back to me, stirring something that smelled like the ginger tea she drank every afternoon now, her doctor's recommendation for the nausea that had returned in the final weeks with an inconvenient persistence. She was moving slowly, the way she moved everything now, with the careful deliberateness of a body that had reached the stage of pregnancy, where every position is a negotiation and every movement requires a moment's advance planning. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment without announcing myself. Not in a surveillance way, but in the way you watch someone you love doing something ordinary when they don't know you're watching, which is when you see them most clearly, most completely, without the layer of awareness that changes how people hold themselves when they know they're being seen. She was humming something low and tuneless under her breath. She did this when she was content, not happy necessarily, not in the bright declarative way, but settled, the particular contentment of someone who is exactly where they are without wishing they were somewhere else. She had not been humming when I arrived 10 days ago. I registered this without comment, the way I registered all the small changes, cataloging them privately as evidence of something I was not yet ready to name out loud. I said, "How's the tea?" She turned, unsurprised. She always heard me coming, had always had that particular awareness of my presence in a space, a fact that had been a source of tenderness between us for years, and was now, I suspected, a source of complicated feeling. She said, "Pointless. It doesn't actually help." I said, "Then why do you keep making it?" She said, "Because the doctor said to, and I have enough battles right now without fighting with my obstetrician." I smiled. She almost smiled. The almost was different from last week's almost, closer to the surface, less defended, requiring less effort to produce and less effort to suppress. I sat at the table, and she brought her tea and sat across from me. Directly across, the way she had been sitting since the Sunday of the fertilization conversation, the corner seat abandoned, and we existed in the same space with the particular ease of people who have said enough of the true things that the space between them has stopped being a minefield and started being just space. Miss Adaisy was sleeping. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Chicago was doing its late October thing. Gray and specific and beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful when the tourist version has been stripped away, and what's left is just the real place, going about its real business. She asked about the call. I told her it was Michel. She nodded. She knew about Michel, knew the shape of what he represented in my life, and she asked the question with the carefully neutral tone of someone who wants the honest answer more than they want the comfortable one. "What did he say?" I told her what he said. "The kitchen misses you. Take your time, but not too much time." And I watched her face process it with the particular transparency that came over her sometimes when her guard was temporarily down. When she was too tired or too present to maintain the careful management of her own expression. I could see very clearly the thing she was not saying. The fear that Michel's call was the beginning of the end of this. The first pull of the tide going back out. The thing she had been bracing for since she had given me the few more days that had turned into 10. I said, "I told him I needed more time." She said, "How much more time?" I said, "I don't know yet." It was honest. It was also insufficient, and we both knew it. But it was all I had that was true, and River had made clear from the beginning that she would take truth over comfort every time. The crack happened that afternoon. Not the conversation. The conversation was still careful, still navigated. But after, when Miss Adaise woke from her nap and called for River, and River went to her, and I heard, through the thin wall of the Pilsen apartment, the sound of River's voice doing the thing it did with her mother, low and warm and completely undefended. All the careful armor set aside, just a daughter with her mother in the late afternoon of things. I was washing the lunch dishes. I stopped. I stood at the sink with my hands in the water, and I listened to the murmur of it without making out the words, just the frequency of it. The specific music of River Okafor talking to someone she loved without reservation. And something in my chest did the thing it had been doing incrementally since the hallway. Opened a little more, admitted a little more light, became a little less the chest of a woman who had organized herself around absence, and a little more the chest of a woman who was, slowly and with enormous difficulty, reorganizing herself around presence. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands. I went and stood in Miss Adaisy's doorway, and River looked up from her mother's bedside, and this time she didn't look away immediately. This time she held my gaze for a moment. 3 seconds, maybe 4, and in those seconds something passed between us that was not a declaration and not a question, but something in between, a recognition, an acknowledgement of something that was still there, and had always been there, and was beginning, despite everything, to make itself known. Ms. Adaise saw it. Of course she saw it. Ms. Adaise saw everything, illness or no illness, fatigue or no fatigue. She looked between us with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something and has just watched it begin to arrive. She said, to no one in particular. Finally. River said, Mama. Miss Adaze said, I'm old and I'm tired and I don't have the patience for slow. River looked at me with an expression that was exasperated and fond and helpless in the specific way that only a parent can make a child feel, and I looked back at her, and I did something I hadn't done since I arrived. I laughed. A real laugh. Not a polite one, not a social one. The laugh that comes from genuine surprise at something that is funny and true at the same time. River blinked. And then, slowly, like something thawing, she laughed too. It was brief, barely 5 seconds, and it was rusty with disuse. The laugh of a woman who hadn't had occasion for one in a while, and it was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 8 months. Ms. Adaze looked satisfied in the way that only people who have engineered an outcome can look satisfied, and she closed her eyes, and River and I stood on opposite sides of her bed, still smiling, looking at each other over her sleeping form, and the crack in the wall between us was visible now to both of us, and neither of us moved to repair it. That evening I cooked properly for the first time since arriving. Not the simple breakfasts and assembled lunches of the previous days, but a real meal, the kind that takes time and attention and the full application of everything I know. I made her mother's egusi soup from memory and instinct, and 3 phone calls to River's Aunt Kioma in Lagos, who talked me through the steps with the particular authority of a woman who has been making this dish for 50 years and has opinions about every component. River sat at the kitchen table and watched me cook, which she had not done before. Had always found something else to do when I was in the kitchen, maintaining the careful distance. And she asked questions, first about the soup and then about Paris, and I answered both. And the conversation moved between past and present, and the soup, and her mother, and the baby, and Michelle, and Chicago, with the naturalness of people who have been talking to each other for 10 years and still, underneath all the damage and the distance, know how to do it. I told her about a dish I had developed in Paris that I had never served anywhere. Too personal, I had thought. Too specific to feel like a restaurant dish. She asked what was in it. I described it. She said, That sounds like Chicago. I said, It was supposed to be Paris. She said, Maybe it was always Chicago. I looked at her across the kitchen and she was looking back at me, and the soup was doing what soup does when it's right, filling the room with the smell of something warm and necessary. And I thought that she might be talking about more than the dish. After dinner, after Ms. Adaze was settled and the dishes were done, and the apartment had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a place winding down for the night, River and I sat on the small sofa, the pull-out still folded, not yet converted to her bed, with our legs not quite touching, and our mugs of tea going warm between our hands. We had not sat like this since before Paris. We had not been this close, this still, this undefended in the same space. The television was off. The street outside was quiet. River had her head tipped back slightly against the sofa cushions, her eyes closed, her breathing the slow, even breathing of someone who is not asleep, but is finally, completely, at rest. I looked at her in the low light of the living room. The curve of her belly, the line of her jaw, the slight parting of her lips, the hands wrapped around the mug. And I thought about 10 years and 8 months and a hallway and a door I had pushed open, and all the mornings with coffee and all the conversations, and the soup and the laugh, and her hand in mine on Sunday afternoon. And I thought, this is the thing no award was ever going to fix. Not the leaving, not the silence, not the distance. This, the specific, irreplaceable texture of this woman in this room, at rest, letting me be near her. This was the thing. I had built a Michelin-starred career on the other side of an ocean, and none of it had come close to the weight of this. She opened her eyes, as if she felt me looking, which she probably did. River had always felt me looking. She said, "Stop." I said, "Stop what?" She said, "Whatever you're thinking. It's too loud." I said, Sorry. She said, No, you're not. I said, No, I'm not. She almost smiled. I almost reached for her hand. We stayed exactly as we were, almost touching, the crack in the wall between us wide enough now to see through, and the light on the other side unmistakable. The email arrived on a Thursday morning at 6:47, while I was standing in River's kitchen making breakfast, and the apartment was still in its early quiet. Ms. Adaz not yet awake, River still on the pullout. The city outside doing its pre-dawn thing with the particular hush that Chicago reserves for the hour before it remembers itself. I had my phone on the counter, face up, the way I always kept it in a kitchen out of habit. And I saw the subject line come through before I had decided to look at it, before I had any defenses in place against what it was going to do to me. It was from Michelle. The subject line was 4 words: Une opportunité. Appelle-moi. An opportunity. Call me. I put down the spatula. I looked at the eggs in the pan for a moment, at the particular stage they had reached. Past runny, not yet set, the exact window where they needed attention or they would become something less than what they were meant to be. I pulled the pan off the heat. I picked up the phone. I read the email twice, standing in River's kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light, and then I set the phone face down on the counter and finished making breakfast, because the eggs needed finishing, and because I needed 2 minutes inside something I could control before I dealt with something I couldn't. Michelle's email was precise in the way that Michelle was always precise. No unnecessary words, no decorative language, just the clean architecture of important information delivered with the efficiency of someone who respected both the information and the recipient enough to not obscure either with sentiment. He had been approached by the owners of a new property in the 7th arrondissement, a space that had been a brasserie for 40 years and was being reimagined from the ground up, a project of significant financial backing and serious culinary ambition. They wanted a name chef. Michelle had recommended me. Not as a sous chef, not as a collaborator, as the chef de cuisine, the head, the creative authority, the name above the door. He had included the projected opening date, 8 months away, and the offer details in broad terms, broad enough to make clear that the financial component was serious and the creative latitude was complete. He ended with, I told them you were the best young chef I had worked with in 30 years. I hope you will not make me a liar. I stood in River's kitchen, and I read this, and I felt, simultaneously, 2 things that had no business existing in the same body at the same time. The specific electric thrill of an ambition being answered at exactly the pitch you had always imagined, and the cold, immediate dread of a person who understands that the answer to one thing is always, necessarily, the complication of another. I didn't tell River that morning. I want to be honest about that. I didn't tell her at breakfast, and I didn't tell her when we sat with her mother through the morning appointment with the visiting nurse, and I didn't tell her when we walked, slowly, around the block after lunch in the pale October sun, because the doctor had said walking was good, and River had started allowing me to accompany her on these daily circuits, which I had understood to be significant, without either of us acknowledging it out loud. I didn't tell her because I needed to know what I thought before I knew what she thought, and I had not yet succeeded in separating those 2 things enough to see them clearly. The offer was everything I had told myself I wanted. 8 months ago, it would have been unambiguous. I would have called Michelle before the email finished loading, and said yes before he finished his greeting. Now it sat in my chest like a question that kept changing shape, because the context of my wanting had changed, and the offer hadn't, and the gap between those 2 things was where all my difficulty lived. I called Michelle from the front steps that afternoon, while River rested and Ms. Adaz slept, and the street did its quiet midday thing around me. Michelle answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call, which meant he already knew something about the shape of my answer from the delay in my calling. He was not a man who was surprised by human behavior. 30 years in professional kitchens had given him a taxonomy of people that was more accurate than most psychological frameworks I had encountered. He said, "You received my email." I said, "I did." He said, "And?" I said, "and I need to tell you something." There was a pause. Then, "Tell me." I told him about River. Not everything. Not the hallway or the fertilization or the Sunday afternoon with her hand in mine. But enough. The essential facts, delivered plainly. A woman I loved. A pregnancy I hadn't known about. A situation that had changed the geography of my life in ways I was still mapping. Michel listened without interrupting, which was one of his great qualities in and out of the kitchen. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was warm and unsentimental in equal measure, "This is why I always said you cooked like someone with more to say than anyone was letting you say. You have been carrying something large." I said, "Yes." He said, "The offer stands for 30 days. After that, the owners will need an answer." 30 days. The number sat in the October air between us, and I felt its weight and its shape, and the way it compressed everything that was still unresolved between River and me into a specific, unmovable deadline. I told River that evening. I had decided, driving back from a pharmacy run for Ms. Adizi's medications, that not telling her was its own form of the old mistake, managing her experience, deciding what she could handle, making choices on her behalf, and that whatever I was now, I was not going to be that. She was in the kitchen when I got back, standing at the counter sorting the medications into the weekly organizer with the careful attention she brought to her mother's care, and I put the pharmacy bag down and I said, "I need to tell you something." She looked up. She read my face, quickly, accurately, in the way she always read my face. And something in her expression steadied, braced. The way it braced when she was preparing for something she had already half anticipated. I told her about the email. I told her about the call. I told her about the offer, all of it, the details, the scope, the timeline, the 30 days. She listened without moving, both hands still on the medication organizer. Her face doing the complicated work of a woman receiving information that is hitting multiple places at once. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's an extraordinary opportunity." The words were right. The voice was careful in a way that told me the carefulness was costing her something. I said, "River." She said, "Don't." I said, "I'm not going to pretend this is a simple decision." She said, "It is a simple decision. It's the opportunity of your career. You go." She said it with the same tone she had used in our kitchen on Paulina Street when I had told her about Paris. The brave voice, the smile underneath it. And I felt something rise in me that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular frustration of watching someone you love perform their own self-erasure with such fluency that they barely notice they're doing it. I said, "Stop." She looked at me. I said, "Stop deciding for me. Stop packaging yourself as the uncomplicated choice, the thing I set aside so I can have the better thing. I am 34 years old, and I am capable of knowing what I want without you organizing the options for me." The words came out with more force than I had intended, and the kitchen went very still, and River stared at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Surprise first, the genuine kind, and then something underneath it that was cracking open, the way things crack open when they've been held together under pressure for too long and something finally gives. She said quietly, "What do you want, Celeste?" Not defensively, not rhetorically, as a real question, asked by a woman who was, for the first time since the hallway, genuinely asking. I looked at her across the kitchen, standing in the low light with her hands on the counter, and her belly enormous, and her eyes doing the bright, controlled thing that meant she was right at the edge of something she hadn't decided to cross yet. And I said, "I want to be here when she's born." The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the medication organizer clicking where River's hand had tightened on it. I said, "I want to be here the morning after and the morning after that. I want to cook for your mother for as long as we have her. I want to figure out what this is between us properly, without a flight hanging over it like a deadline. I stopped. River had not moved. I said, I want the restaurant too. I'm not going to pretend I don't. But I want to know if there is a version of both. If there is a conversation to be had with Michelle about timing, about remote development, about an opening in 8 months that gives us time to... She said, us. I stopped. She said very carefully, you said us. I said, I know. She said, that's the first time you've said that. I said, I know. I should have been saying it for longer. She put the medication organizer down. She turned to face me fully, both hands at her sides, her expression open in a way it had not been since before Paris. Undefended, unmanaged, just River, looking at me with the full weight of 10 years and 8 months and everything that had happened in between. She said, I'm scared. 2 words, delivered without decoration, costing her visibly. I said, I know. Me too. She said, if you leave again. I said, I know. She said, I mean it, Celeste. If you leave again, that's it. I can't. I said, I know. I hear you. I crossed the kitchen. Not rushing, deliberately. Giving her every opportunity to step back, to reassert the distance, to change her mind. She didn't step back. I stopped in front of her, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her, close enough that the baby was between us in the most literal sense, and I said, I'm not leaving. She looked at me for a long moment, with the eyes of a woman deciding whether to believe something she wants to be true. Then she leaned her forehead against mine. Just that. Just the lightest possible contact. Foreheads touching in the dim kitchen light. And she exhaled. Long and slow. The exhalation of 8 months of held breath, finally finding somewhere to go. We stayed like that for a long time, foreheads together, not kissing, not speaking, just the proximity of it. The simple, enormous fact of being close after so much distance. The baby moved. We both felt it, both registered it at the same moment, and River made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. And I put my hand on her belly without asking, the first time I had touched her there, and the baby moved again as if in response. And River lifted her head and looked at me with an expression so open and so exhausted and so full of a love that had been patient far beyond what should have been required of it that I had to close my eyes for a moment to hold the weight of it. When I opened them, she was still looking at me. She said, "Call Michelle." I said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Tonight." I said, "River," she said, "call him tonight. Tell him you need to discuss the timeline. Tell him you have a daughter coming. Tell him whatever you need to tell him. But call him tonight, because I need to know that you are actually choosing this, and not just standing in my kitchen being brave about it." She was right. She was always right when it mattered. I called Michel that night, from the front steps, in the cold, and told him I needed 30 days and a conversation about the opening timeline, and that there were personal developments he should know about. He listened. He said, "The kitchen will wait for the right chef." I said, "Thank you, Michel." He said, "Go be with your family, Celeste." I stood on the steps of the Pilsen apartment in the October cold, and I felt for the first time in 8 months that the word family was not abstract. It was specific. It was a pull-out sofa and a medication organizer and a woman who set us back to me with her whole frightened heart. It was right inside this door, and I was not leaving. She came on a Friday, not dramatically. Nothing about the beginning of it was dramatic, which is the thing about births that no one tells you accurately, that they begin so quietly, so incrementally, that the first hour is almost indistinguishable from any other hour, except for a quality of attention that sharpens in the body before the mind catches up. I know this because I was there. I was in the kitchen at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, doing what I always do when I can't sleep. Moving through a space quietly, touching things, organizing, the tactile ritual of a kitchen person finding stillness through motion. I had been in Chicago for 18 days. Michelle and I had spoken twice more since the Thursday call, and the shape of something possible was beginning to emerge. A delayed opening, a remote development period, a version of the future that included Paris, and included this apartment, and included the terrifying, necessary work of rebuilding something that had been broken by love and was being repaired by more of the same. River and I had not kissed. We had not defined anything. We had been existing in the careful, charged territory of two people who have said us and I'm not leaving, and are now living inside those words, testing their weight, seeing if the structure holds. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, the most intimacy I had felt in years. The specific closeness of two people choosing each other slowly, deliberately, without the rush of early love to carry them past the hard parts. I heard her at 2:14. A sound from the living room. Not a cry, not a call. Just a sharp intake of breath followed by a silence that had a different quality from sleeping silence. A silence that was awake and assessing. I set down the glass I was drying. I went to the doorway. River was sitting up on the pullout, both hands on her belly, her face in the expression of someone doing interior calculation, measuring something, timing something, deciding something. She looked up when I appeared, and her expression did the thing it did less often now, the bracing thing, though this time it was not against me but against whatever was happening in her body. She said very calmly, "I think it's starting." I said, "How long?" She said, "The tightening has been happening for about an hour. I didn't want to wake you." Of course she hadn't wanted to wake me. Of course she had been sitting in the dark for an hour, managing the beginning of labor alone, not wanting to be a disruption. I said, "River." She said, "I know." I said, "You have to stop doing that." She said, with the ghost of a smile that was becoming less rare, "I know. I'm working on it." I timed the contractions while she changed and gathered the bag she had packed with the same color-coded thoroughness she applied to everything. Hospital bag ready since week 34, labeled and organized, nothing left to chance. They were coming every 12 minutes, which her birth plan said meant we had time but not unlimited time. And I moved through the apartment with the particular focused calm of a person who has spent 20 years in professional kitchens, learning that panic is the enemy of good outcomes, and that the only useful response to pressure is to become more precise, not less. I made her a small cup of the ginger tea she hated, but drank because the doctor said to. I called the hospital and spoke to the nurse on duty, who confirmed we should come in when contractions reached 7 minutes. I woke Ms. Ades gently, in the way I had learned to wake her, with her name first, twice, softly, giving her time to surface before any other information arrived. Ms. Ades opened her eyes and I told her, and her face did the enormous thing it did when something she had been waiting for arrived. And she reached for my hand and held it with a strength that surprised me, the grip of a woman who was not going to miss this regardless of what her body had to say about it. She said, "Get my daughter to that hospital." The drive was 23 minutes. I know because I counted, the way I count everything in a kitchen, as a form of control over the uncontrollable. River sat in the passenger seat with her birth plan folder in her lap. Actual paper, actually printed, because River did not trust the important things to phone batteries. And between contractions, she was almost entirely herself, asking me questions about the Michelle conversation, about the timeline we had discussed, about whether I had called my mother yet to tell her I was staying in Chicago. Between contractions, she was River, practical and curious and completely present. During contractions, she went somewhere interior, somewhere I couldn't follow, breathing through it with a concentration so complete and so private that I understood, watching her, that she had been preparing for this for months, alone, and that the preparation had been thorough. I drove, and I did not tell her everything was going to be fine. Because River did not find empty reassurance reassuring, and I had learned this about her in the first year of knowing her and had never forgotten it. I said at one point, in the middle of a contraction that seemed longer than the previous ones, "You're doing incredibly," she said, eyes closed, voice strained. "Don't talk to me right now," I said. "Understood." She almost smiled through the pain. I kept driving. The hospital received us with the efficient warmth of a maternity ward that has done this 10,000 times and understands that the people arriving are experiencing it for the first, or in this case, first and only, time, and deserve to be treated accordingly. A nurse named Dominique took River's arm and walked her through the intake with a calm authority that I recognized as the clinical equivalent of what I tried to do in a kitchen during a difficult service. Keeping the energy level, keeping the motion, not letting panic find a foothold anywhere in the room. I handled the paperwork, which River had also prepared in advance. The folder contained copies of everything, organized by tab, with a handwritten note at the front that said, "In case I am not able to speak clearly, please refer to Section 3 for my preferences." I handed it to Dominique, who looked at it and then looked at me with an expression of professional appreciation and said, "She prepared this herself?" I said, "She prepares everything herself." Dominique said, "I can tell." We were moved to a room, and the machines were connected, and the numbers on the monitors began telling the story of a woman's body doing the most extraordinary, ordinary thing it knows how to do. And I stood beside River's bed, and she reached for my hand without looking at me. Just reached, sideways, into the space where she had apparently decided I would be. And I was there, and she held on. The labor was 9 hours. I will not pretend I have the language for all of it, for the specific quality of those 9 hours, the way time moved differently inside them, simultaneously too fast and geological in its slowness. I can tell you that I did not leave the room except once, briefly, to call Ms. Adaisi's overnight nurse and confirm that she was settled and resting and knew what was happening. I can tell you that River was, in labor as in everything, a person of extraordinary internal resources, that she moved through the hours with a fierce, focused endurance that I had never witnessed anything like, and that watching her I understood things about her that 10 years of loving her had not fully shown me. Things about the depth of her and the quality of her and the specific, irreplaceable nature of what it meant to be River Okafor in the world. I can tell you that at hour 6, when the pain was at its peak and the epidural was wearing, and she was past the point of managing her expression, she turned to me with her eyes full and said, "I'm glad you're here." 4 words, delivered between contractions, in the voice of someone who has nothing left to use for anything except the absolute truth. I held her hand tighter and I said, "I'm not going anywhere." And she closed her eyes and breathed, and the monitor kept its steady count, and I stayed exactly where I was. She came at 11:47 in the morning. The room had the particular quality of rooms where something enormous is happening. Compressed and bright, and full of a focused attention that excluded everything outside its walls. Dominique was there, and River's obstetrician, a woman named Dr. Vasquez, who had the efficient warmth of someone who has presided over miracles so many times that she has learned to honor them without losing the clinical precision that keeps them safe. I was at River's left side, her hand in both of mine, and I heard Dr. Vasquez say one more in the specific tone of a person who means it, and River made a sound I have no adequate description for. Not a scream, not a cry, but something that contained all 9 hours and 8 months and 10 years, and every brave thing she had ever done alone. And then there was another sound entirely, a sound from outside River's body, small and indignant, and completely, overwhelmingly alive. And Dr. Vasquez said, "She's here," and I looked, and she was. They put her on River's chest before she was fully cleaned, the way River's birth plan had requested. And River's face. I need to try to describe River's face in that moment, though I know I will fail, because some things exceed the capacity of language to contain them. She looked at her daughter with an expression that was beyond joy and beyond relief and beyond love in any form I had previously understood the word to encompass. She looked at her the way you look at the thing you have been moving toward your entire life without knowing its exact shape. And then you see it, and you understand that the moving was always for this. That every step and every cost and every lonely night and every brave choice was a coordinate on a map that was always going to end here, in this room, with this weight on your chest and this face looking up at you with the ancient, furious confusion of someone brand new to the world. River said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, a voice made entirely of wonder. Hi, baby, I'm your mama. And the baby blinked. And River laughed and cried simultaneously, the way people do when the feeling is too large for either alone. And I stood beside her with my hand on her shoulder and my eyes full, and my chest doing something I had no name for. Some reorganization of everything I had previously understood myself to be. Dr. Vasquez looked at me and said, "Would you like to cut the cord?" I looked at River. River looked at me. We had not discussed this. It was not in the birth plan, because the birth plan had been written when I was in Paris and River was alone, and this moment had not been available to plan for. River said, with the soft certainty of a woman who has just arrived at the far side of something enormous and found her footing there, "Yes, she should." I cut the cord. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The kitchen trains you for this, for the precision required in moments of high feeling, for the ability to do the delicate thing carefully even when everything in you wants to be less than careful. I cut the cord, and I looked at this child. 7 pounds and 2 ounces of furious, perfect, brand new person, and she looked back at me with the unfocused gaze of the newborn, and something happened in me that was not gradual and was not incremental, and was nothing like the slow accumulation of the previous 18 days. It was immediate. It was complete. It was the kind of knowing that doesn't require any of the apparatus of the mind. No reasoning, no evidence, no deliberation. I knew her. Not the way you know someone you have met, the way you know something that has always been true and has simply been waiting for the correct moment to become visible. She was mine. Not legally, not biologically, not by any framework that the world had language for yet. But in the room, in the bright, specific reality of 11:47 on a Friday morning in October, she was mine, and I was hers. And River was watching me understand this, with an expression that was exhausted and luminous, and more open than anything I had seen from her since before the silence began. I held her at noon, standing beside River's bed, while River rested against her pillows with her eyes half closed, and her breathing finally, the breathing of someone who has set down an enormous weight. The baby was wrapped and warm, and astonishingly small in my arms, which had held many things, pans and plates, and the architecture of elaborate dishes, and had never held anything that rearranged the entire interior landscape the way this did. She had River's nose. She had a faint suggestion of River's jawline. She had her eyes shut, which meant I couldn't see what color they were going to be, and I understood that there was a whole future full of things I was not going to be able to see yet, could not predict or control or prepare for, and that this was not terrifying in the way I might have expected, but was instead the most interesting thing I had ever been offered. River said from the pillow, without opening her eyes, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking she's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen." River said, "She is." I said, "What's her name?" River was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her eyes and looked at us, at her daughter in my arms, at me holding her, and she said, "I was going to name her alone. I had a name picked." I said, "What was it?" She said, "Adaizi," the name of her mother, the name that meant daughter of a king in Igbo, or daughter of something great, something worth descending from. I looked at the baby. I looked at River. I said, "It's perfect." River said, "I know." She closed her eyes again. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a commentary on the situation, and I said to her, very quietly, so only she could hear, "Hello, Adaze. I'm Celeste. I'm going to be here." She did not respond, being 11 minutes old and having other priorities. But River, eyes still closed, almost smiled, and that was enough. There is a dish I have been developing in my head for 3 years that I have never cooked for anyone. I started it in the last months at Linden & Co., when I was restless and reaching for something I couldn't name, and I carried it to Paris where it grew more complex and more personal until Michel, who had a gift for reading what a chef was actually trying to say underneath the technique, looked at my notes one afternoon and said, "This dish is not French." I said, "No." He said, "It is not trying to be." I said, "No." He looked at the notes for another moment and then looked at me and said, "Cook it when you're ready, not before." I had not been ready in Paris. I had not been ready in the weeks of the Maison Noire event, or in the first days in River's hallway, or in the careful mornings with coffee and Ms. Adaze and the slow reconstruction of something broken. I was ready on a Sunday in November, 3 weeks after Adaze was born, in the kitchen of the Pilsen apartment with the November light coming through the window, and the baby asleep in the bassinet in the living room, and River at the kitchen table watching me with the particular quality of attention she had begun to allow herself since the hospital. Open, undefended. The watching of a woman who has decided, finally, to let herself see what is in front of her without the mediation of fear. I cooked it for River. It took 4 hours. She ate it in silence, slowly, and when she finished she said, "That's Chicago." I said, "That's here." She looked at me across the table and said, "Yes." The weeks after Adaze's birth had their own particular texture, dense and exhausted and full of a tenderness so constant it became its own kind of weather. I had moved off the hotel. I had been splitting time between a hotel near Maison Noire and the Pilsen apartment, maintaining the fiction of a temporary arrangement that had long since stopped being temporary, and I was sleeping on the floor of the living room on an air mattress that River had insisted on providing and that I had insisted was fine, and that was, objectively, not fine, but was also the best sleeping arrangement I had experienced in months, because it was in this apartment, and this apartment was where everything was. The logistics of a newborn in a small space, with a sick grandmother and a woman recovering from labor and a chef who had a restaurant offer waiting in Paris were, on paper, unreasonable. In practice, they had the strange, improvised grace of things that work not because they were planned, but because everyone involved wants them to work badly enough to make them work anyway. I took the night feeding it too. River pumped, I fed, she slept. The baby and I sat in the kitchen in the dark with the city quiet outside, and Adaze looking at me with the unfocused intensity of the very new, working out what the world was. And River took the 5 a.m., and I slept until 7, and then made breakfast. And we did it again. Ms. Adaze met her granddaughter on the morning of the second day, when River carried her into the room wrapped in the yellow blanket that Ms. Adaze had been crocheting since August, slowly and with difficulty, but with a ferocity of intention that had produced something imperfect and completely beautiful. She held her for a long time, very carefully, with the particular attentiveness of someone who understands they are holding something they need to memorize. She said, in Igbo first, and then in English for the room, "She has the face of someone who knows things." River said, "She's 3 days old, Mama." Ms. Adaze said, "Some people arrive knowing." She looked at the baby for another long moment, and then looked at me across the room, with an expression that contained the entire compressed weight of everything she had told me in the mornings at the kitchen table, every fragment of context and history, and the things she had said. "She never stopped loving you." And her eyes said, "Now you know what to do with it." I nodded. She nodded back. It was the most complete conversation I had ever had without words. The call with Michel came on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks after the birth, on a morning when the apartment was quiet, and River had taken Adaise to the pediatrician for her first checkup, and I was alone with Ms. Adaise and the particular stillness of a place temporarily released from its own busyness. Michelle and I had spoken 4 times since the Thursday of the offer. Careful, honest conversations. The kind that require both people to say true things they would prefer not to say, and to listen to true things they would prefer not to hear. Michel was not a man who dealt in false comfort or convenient fictions. He had told me, in the second conversation, that the owners were asking for a decision within the original 30-day window, and that 30 days was now 17. He had told me, in the third, that he understood what I was navigating, but that understanding had practical limits, and the restaurant business operated in real time regardless of personal circumstances. He had told me, in the fourth, that whatever I decided, he wanted me to decide it fully, not halfway, not with one foot in each option, because a chef who is half somewhere is fully nowhere, and fully nowhere is no good to anyone. This was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in months. I had made my decision 3 days before the call. I knew it the way I had known the dish was ready, not because I had reasoned my way to it, but because one morning I woke up on the air mattress in the Pilsen apartment, and the baby was making small sounds in the bassinet, and I could hear River moving in the kitchen, and Ms. Adaise's television murmuring through the wall, and the November light was coming through the window at the angle that made everything look like the beginning of something. And I lay there in the specific fullness of that ordinary moment, and I understood that there was no version of a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris that was worth more than this. Not more than the air mattress. Not more than the 2 a.m. feeding. Not more than River at the kitchen table watching me cook the dish I had been developing for 3 years. Not more than a Daisy's face in the dark, working out the world. I had built a career on the premise that the best thing I could make was a dish. I had been wrong. The best thing I could make was this specific, improbable, reconstructed life, made from the ingredients of a mistake and a love that had survived it. I told Michel I was staying in Chicago. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." I said, "You knew before I called." He said, "I knew before you knew. Some people cook like they are searching for something. You have stopped searching." I said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "It is the opposite of a problem. It means you are ready." I said, "For what?" He said, "To cook the best food of your life, in whatever kitchen you choose." I told River that evening. She was nursing Adaise on the sofa, the apartment in its 7 p.m. softness, the dinner I had made still fragrant from the kitchen. Ms. Adaise dozing in the armchair she had insisted on being moved to, so she could be in the room with everyone. I sat beside her, close, the careful closeness we had been maintaining, still not crossing the last distance but inhabiting the near side of it fully, completely, without apology. I said, "I called Michel today." She looked at me over the top of Adaise's head. I said, "I told him I'm staying." She was very still. The baby continued nursing, indifferent to the enormity of the moment, which seemed right. Adaise had been present at all the important moments since before she was born and had maintained throughout a serene, practical focus on her own requirements that I found deeply instructive. River said, "In Chicago." I said, "In this apartment, if you'll have me, or nearby, however makes sense, but in Chicago, with you, with both of you." She looked at me for a long time, the kind of long that contains multitudes. I did not fill it. I had learned, finally and completely, to let River's silences be what they were. Not absence, but presence of a different kind, the presence of a woman thinking something real. She said, "What about the restaurant?" I said, "Michel thinks there will be opportunities in Chicago. He's going to make some calls. And I have been thinking—" I stopped. She said, "Tell me." I said, "I have been thinking about something smaller, something that is mine from the beginning, not inherited. Something that cooks like Chicago, and not like an idea of what Chicago should be." She was quiet. Then she said, That's what the dish tasted like on Sunday. I said, yes. She said, like something that knew exactly where it was. I looked at her, at River, at Adaz, at Miss Adaz asleep in the armchair, at the Pilsen apartment with its good morning light and its plants on the windowsill and its kitchen where I had cooked more honestly in 3 weeks than in a year in Paris. And I said, I know exactly where I am. River looked at me with the expression she had been slowly allowing herself since the hospital. Open, unguarded, the full face of a woman who has decided that trust, imperfect and terrifying as it is the only available door into the life she actually wants. She said, Celeste. I said, yes. She said, come here. I closed the last of the distance. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about the physical fact of it. No cinematic quality to the way I moved the 12 inches that remained between us and put my arm around her, and she leaned into me with the exhausted completeness of a woman who has been holding herself upright for 8 months and has finally found somewhere to put the weight down. A daisy was between us, small and warm and completely unconcerned, and Ms. Daisy slept in the armchair, and the November light did its last thing through the window, and the dinner was on the stove, and the apartment smelled like everything I had been cooking toward for years without knowing the recipe. River said, against my shoulder, very quietly, I love you. She said it the way she said the true things, plainly, directly, without decoration, delivered like a fact, because for River it was a fact, had always been a fact, had remained a fact through Paris and the silence and the 8 months and the hallway and all of it. I said, I love you. The same way, because it was also a fact, had also always been a fact, had also survived everything. Adaz made a small sound of contentment or complaint. With a 3-week-old it was genuinely hard to tell. And River laughed, the real laugh, the one that had come back slowly over the weeks and was now almost fully itself again. And I laughed too, and Ms. Adaz stirred in the armchair and said, without fully waking, finally, which was exactly right, which was the only word for it, finally. I opened the restaurant 8 months later. It was small, 12 tables, an open kitchen, a menu that changed with the market and the season and whatever I was thinking about that week, a philosophy that Michelle called honest and the Chicago Tribune called revelatory, and that I called here, because that was what it was, a restaurant that knew exactly where it was and cooked accordingly. We named it Adaz. River designed the logo, a clean, beautiful thing, her handwriting made into a typeface, the name arcing across the front window of a space on a corner in Pilsen, 4 blocks from the apartment where everything had been reconstructed. Ms. Adaz came to the soft opening in her wheelchair, dressed in the particular splendor she reserved for important occasions, and she ate everything and said the agouti soup was almost as good as hers, and that this was the highest compliment she was prepared to give. She was there for 4 more months after that, which was 3 months longer than the doctors had initially indicated, which River said was entirely consistent with her mother's lifelong practice of exceeding expectations. She left on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in her sleep, in the room with the good light, with River beside her, and Adaz in the bassinet in the corner, and me in the kitchen making the tea that didn't help, which I made anyway because the doctor had said to, and some habits outlast their reasons. We held the funeral on a Saturday, and the restaurant was closed, and I cooked for 100 people in the community hall down the street, and every dish was something Miss Adaz had described to me at the kitchen table in the mornings when she was telling me things River wouldn't tell herself. River and I got married the following October, a year to the month after the hallway. Not a large wedding. We were not large wedding people. Neither of us had the patience for the performance of it. But a real one. In the back room of the restaurant after closing, with 30 people who mattered, and Adaz in a white dress being held by River's aunt Kioma, who had flown from Lagos and wept comprehensively and appropriately throughout. I had asked River on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, without planning to, the way the true things always arrived. She was at the table, Adai's in her lap, and I was at the stove, and I turned around and I said, "Marry me." She looked up from the baby. She said, "That's not a question." I said, "No." She said, "Ask me properly." I said, "River, will you marry me?" She said, "You're still not asking." I crossed the kitchen and I got down on one knee on the Pilsen apartment floor, which was cold and slightly sticky in the way of kitchen floors everywhere. And I said, "River Okafor, I left once and it was the worst decision I have ever made, and I have made some genuinely terrible decisions in professional kitchens that resulted in real financial damage. Will you please marry me?" She said, "The kitchen floor part was unnecessary." I said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "Yes." Adizi, who was 14 months old and had recently developed opinions about everything, said, "Yeah," which we counted. The Michelin inspector came in February of the second year. I didn't know she was there. I never know, which is the point, which is how it works. I was in the kitchen, doing what I do, cooking like someone who knows exactly where they are, and River was at the small table near the kitchen window that we kept for family on busy nights, nursing a glass of wine and doing the restaurant's bookkeeping on her laptop with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and Adiz was asleep in the back office in the portable crib we kept there, and the service was full, and the room was warm, and the food was the food. Honest, specific, located, a cuisine that tasted like a corner in Pilsen and like nothing else on earth. The star came in April. Michel called before the announcement and said, "I told you." I said, "You did." He said, "How does it feel?" I looked through the pass at the dining room, at the 12 tables, at the open kitchen, at the name on the window in River's handwriting, at River at the family table looking up from her laptop at exactly the right moment, catching my eye through the pass with the expression that was now as familiar to me as my own hands, the expression of a woman who is completely where she is supposed to be. I said, "It feels like here." Michel said, "Good. That is exactly what a star should feel like. Here is what I know now, that I did not know when I pushed open a door in a Chicago hallway on a Tuesday in October and heard 3 words that rearranged my life. I know that love is not a feeling you have and then keep. It is a practice, daily and deliberate, made of 10,000 ordinary choices. To show up, to listen, to put down the knife, to ask the real question, to close the last 12 inches, to stay. I know that ambition and love are not opposites, that the best work I have ever done happened inside a life that was full rather than empty, that the restaurant I dreamed about in Paris became real in Chicago, because Chicago was where the truth was, and you cannot cook honestly from a lie. I know that a daughter can rearrange the entire interior geography of a person in the span of 11 minutes, and that this rearranging is not a loss, but an expansion, the self becoming larger rather than smaller, capable of more rather than less. I know that some people arrive knowing, as Ms. Adiz said, and that Adiz, our Adiz, 2 years old now and already expressing opinions about the menu with a confidence that Michel would recognize, arrived knowing something about all of us that took the rest of us considerably longer to understand. And I know, this above all, this most completely, that the thing no award was ever going to fix was not broken. It was waiting. It was River, in a small kitchen in Pilsen, with her hand on her belly, and her mother in the next room, and a love so patient and so enormous that it held its shape through 8 months of silence, and a hallway, and a cracked door, and all the imperfect necessary work of 2 women finding their way back to the only place that ever made complete sense. Here. Always here. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Celeste's mistakes or River's courage or the love that survived both, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me which moment got you. Tell me if you've ever loved someone the way these women loved each other, imperfectly, stubbornly, and with everything. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Stories about women who choose each other, over and over, in all the ways that choosing is hard and real and worth every single cost. I'll see you in the next one.